Owned by the National Broadcasting Company. We've been broadcasting from our transmitter located on Mount Wilson, California, at an elevation of more than 6,200 feet. Until we return to the air with our first program this morning, speaking for the staff and management of KNBC, this is Victor Bozeman wishing you all good night.
I remember the exact moment when I realized that nearly everyone in my peer group was white-knuckling their daily lives and nobody had their shit together. I mean, I sure as hell didn't, but that had been true most of my life. This moment came out of nowhere, though, when a close lifelong friend who I thought had it all gave me a call from a hotel room in Atlantic City. He was there at the Borgata with one of the secretaries from his job where he was vice president of electrical services, and he was basically pissing away his marriage. The couple I thought were madly in love for a decade, had the big corner house in the nice neighborhood, the great jobs, the cool children, were as miserable and unfulfilled as I was, at least in that moment. He wanted me to get on a train and come down to party like the old days. I just kind of laughed and hung up. The divorce followed swiftly on this event's heels. My boy is a dog and a cheater, but he's going to own up to it and deal with the fallout. Whatever sort of fever madness gripped his mind and led to that dalliance, a longing for a time and place past and no longer accessible, it was all over. All that was left now was the crying. I turned this event and the fallout over in my mind a lot after it happened. It was a perfect crystalline specimen to add to a growing constellation of peculiar human behaviors and pervasive pathologies that had begun to haunt my mind, mostly centered around nostalgia and the futile pursuit of what was gone. Not just somewhere else, and not as simple as something destroyed, but a collection of relationships, emotions, and brain patterns that only existed in a time, and that was now past, and could never ever be returned to. Being born in the early 80s and tromping through what will most likely be the last decade of prosperity in the history of the American Empire, the irascible 90s, I felt a deep sense of being ripped off by society's promises fermenting in my guts now in my 30s. I had a dying relationship, a job I hated, in debt up to my eyeballs, exhausted and sleepwalking through what were supposed to be years of my life spent being the most productive, or making the most strides towards some type of mastery of art or craft, and yet all I could do with any free time I acquired was cope. Coping has become the number one source of escape, pleasure, satisfaction, and sublimation of desire in our generation. As ever with humans, the pursuit of lighting up the reward center of our brain has now itself been distilled into a series of ritualized activities that are highly tuned to hotwire our sense of fulfillment and satisfaction, away from productive ends, and toward ends that are easy to monetize and use for control purposes. Some of these rituals are ancient indeed, having an affair, being a drunk, etc. Some are newer, or variations on old forms juiced to exquisite new potency by digital optimizations. Gambling has been taken to strange new places by the digital age, as a for instance. Making a wager is nothing new, and taken to a point can even be a healthy social bonding pastime. Small stakes, silly bets, social atmospheres, and games like cards. With digital vectors cracking open gaming parlors and spilling their offerings out into the great vast wilderness for everyone to enjoy, whether they lived somewhere it was legal or not, and more importantly whether they were an adult or not, gambling and wager is now baked into so many forms of popular entertainment media. Sports gambling is now more pervasive than ever. Shady gray internet casinos offer literally whatever type of table game or slot machine experience anyone could want. The entire global economy is underpinned by a form of gambling that's laundered in the word speculation, or old concepts twisted into new forms like lending and debt. Value as a concept has been tortured into new forms by exotic securities and made to perform intense dances that appeal to investors, who themselves possess barrels of meaningless speculated value, or even worse, something like cryptocurrency. Perhaps the one that offends me most is the infiltration of video games, a sacred medium to me, by predatory gambling, mostly targeted at children. Would you be surprised at all if I told you that right now your 10-year-old child could take some of the trinkets and toys they've acquired on their Steam profile with pocket money, they've done through the aforementioned shady gray market websites, and within minutes be placing wagers of cold hard cash down on whatever type of no-shit casino gambling type game they wanted? No exaggeration. If you're not surprised, are you at least sickened? And then there's nostalgia. We're in a deluge of nostalgia-based coping the past decade or so. We've seen aesthetic and art movements spring up around earnest appreciation of bygone conventions, mediums, and formats. The vaporwave microgenre was one of the first coherent pingings of my radar in this regard, but quickly on its heels followed more cultural inertia roping in things like analog media, liminal spaces, and even artful exploration of the dread of dead places like malls, times, and culture. Capital has a well-developed sixth sense for when a cultural movement becomes ready to monetize. People ensconced within the communities grow into adults who need to make a living, and oftentimes want to do so while working in close proximity to things they like, understood, or are passionate about. These people are the carriers who signal to the mothership that it's time to harvest. And just as the flower begins to blossom, when it at its most beautiful and intriguing, capital cuts its head off and begins to tear apart with probing tendrils every petal, every facet of said cultural offering. To understand the structures within, the organic bonds of creation, human labor and artifice that brought these elements together, so that it can begin to regurgitate and vomit a vulgarized form back at us with a price tag until we can no longer consume more. And so we march into the age of nostalgia, a most pernicious form of coping indeed, because what triggers the good feels isn't anything so base as a chemical or a sexual touch, but a memory, or sometimes a memory of a memory, or even an implanted sense of a memory that doesn't even belong to the person pursuing it. The commodification of memories and the emotions tied to them, and the monetization vector itself being things like film remakes, retro garbage consumer goods, TV series painfully and clumsily set in idealized versions of recent times past, and crude attempts to inject the exact aesthetics of dead art into new things for sale. Not a synthesis, influence, or healthy culture of the borrowing or repurposing of art, as seen in, say, hip-hop music, but an intentional ploy to turn a buck on someone's fond remembrance for better times. A remembrance that takes executive control of someone based on their desire to escape the horrors of our current material conditions. Coping. What's worse is that nostalgia for better times has often been the animus for reactionary movements throughout history. One of the oldest tricks in the book is to offer someone you yourself are making miserable through exploitation and subjugation a return to a past that seemed better, a series of material conditions that was degraded and stolen from them, often by some cultural enemy or population class marked for destruction. The futility is the bitch of it, a painful yearning for a time that no longer exists. Most human pursuits are firmly ephemeral, and for good reason. Human relationships need to be adaptable and flexible to changing needs. A person leaves, a baby is born, a child grows and develops new needs. People change over time. What satisfied a group of people for a time no longer does. As each of these navigable speed bumps appear in our lives, we should, with aplomb, pursue new conventions, art, and social relations that now please us as groups of friends, family, and community anew. The clinging to what was is maladaptive, a symptom of anxiety, fear, the dread thought that what may be will not be as comfortable as what was. In modern society, as material conditions degrade more severely, that fear is validated often, and so retreat into a tunnel of nostalgia becomes the most desirable and safe move. And what follows are efforts to brick people up inside with junk commodities and media to keep them stagnant, uninterested in new pursuits, controllable, and anxious. To that end, outside of the mainstream, nostalgia appeals with gaudy, slicked-up reboots of old franchises and characters. The frayed fringes of artistic creation instead focus on the intense loneliness and muted horror of nostalgia for dead culture, especially of places, franchises, commodities, and brands. Better examples being things like Stranger Things, the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, Skinamarink, communities of artists experimenting with analog horror and short subject film and gaming. Everyone is white-knuckling it, exhausted, terrified of the future, scared of losing what they have and watching it dwindle away anyway. Institutions are falling apart, governments are full of con men, rapists, senile gerontocrats, and like a prophetic shaman once opined in the Dead Flag Blues, the car's on fire and there's no driver at the wheel. It's no wonder that a longing for time past has become a dominant and haunting vector for coping and being exploited by capital. Perhaps these are the stirrings of change. Perhaps when enough are incubated with this desire for better times driven by a clear-eyed assessment of current material conditions, we as a society can begin to take steps to remedy those conditions. But with so much cozy, comfortable, digestible, safe coping on offer, why would we?